This is a summary of the Pathwork Steps online teleconference meetings during the month of April 2018. The topic was Energy and Consciousness in Distortion, which the guide defines as evil. That's Pathwork Lecture 197. I divided it into 4 subtopics. The first was a definition, an examination of unified states of consciousness and energy, and then disunified states of consciousness and energy. The premise being that when energy and consciousness are not aligned, that's the opportunity for lower self distortion, which the guide is defining as evil. The second subtopic was how to find evidence of disunification. The short version of that is that that's where disharmonies come in. Gut feeling that something is wrong, a sense of what is going on is destructive rather than constructive. We're not unaware of when things aren't in alignment, but we may not be skilled at identifying the different factors. So what we do is we will leap to a conclusion or an interpretation that isn't really what's going on, but honestly it's good enough. That is a justification or a rationalization for us to disconnect. The problem with that is it's not in truth. It's not a true examination of what is going on. It's a leap to a conclusion or interpretation which could be in error. So as we make our interpretations, we are making them with the ego state that we are in. If that is aligned and unified and clear, then the interpretations are pretty harmonious with spiritual law. If the ego state is not aligned, if it is affected by forcing currents, repressed needs, defensive systems, then its interpretation will wind up being biased. Now, that's not a bad thing because the topic will come up again. It won't be resolved. It won't turn out happily ever after. It will come back at you. So it's a skill to learn, to identify evidence of disunification. The third topic was resistance. And here the guide brought in a significant section that mirrored the spiritual meaning of crisis, which was an earlier lecture. It's Pathwork Lecture 183. And what he was trying to say here is that resistance is disunification. It represents a disunification. And if resistance goes on too long and the destructive energies go on too long, then a crisis will occur. Now, in the spiritual meaning of crisis, the guide talks about how this is a healthy and good thing. That for instance, as a structure builds, I like building sandcastles. As you build sandcastles or card houses or stack dominoes, there's a point where if it's not stable, the whole thing collapses. Okay, a small flaw in the beginning won't matter, but after a while, it does affect the stability of the entire structure. And this, the guide describes as a natural spiritual ebb and flow dynamic, where something that is misaligned will inevitably collapse to some degree, giving us an opportunity to rebuild. So it's a different perspective on crisis, and of course when we're in it, we may be distressed, we may be frightened, and so as a sidebar, it is useful to learn these concepts and learn about to learn languaging about spiritual matters, to learn exercises, ways of identifying before the moment that you actually need them. So in the moment of crisis, in the moment of drama or confrontation, this is not a good time to learn things. This is a good time to practice skills that you have been developing. If not, then another day. The fourth topic was the power of positive intentionality. Now, when I first started studying pathwork, I used to say I was normal, and now I'm not, in that I used to believe in the normal series of human events, the normal interpretations, I relied on real world feedback, and I wasn't aware. I did understand spirituality. I did understand there was other things going on, but I couldn't name it, so I didn't spend time trying to name it. So when I was normal, uh, when someone said this is a 30% chance or a 50% chance, and the next time they said it was a 12% chance, I would get annoyed and say, make up your mind. When I first began reading the Pathwork lectures, the guide many, many times uses a ratio of how much more powerful positive intentionality is than negative intentionality. How much more powerful good deeds are than negative lower self deeds. How much more powerful one person's work is than they realize. And he would bring in numbers. And the numbers kept changing. It's 4 times, it's 25 times, it's 100 times. And I remember getting irritated at the lectures saying, make up your mind. And then I hit a transcendent moment, an aha moment, and realized, oh, he's just trying to give an indication. There are no ratios in the spirit world. You can't define the spirit world down to this is worth 4 quarters and this is worth 3 cents and this is worth $1.50. This action is 4 times, this action is 10 times. That's a simplistic human way to understand. And in that moment, I crossed over from my certainty about the world, my reliance on data and science and management principles, into a softer, gentler, and yet more rich world of feeling into what was right, to examining the energy of something to tell whether I felt it was in alignment with spiritual principles, whether it was positive and constructive, or whether there was something bothering me. And even if I didn't know how to name that, to pause and respect it. So in the power of positive intentionality, the bottom line is positive intentionality is always more powerful than lower self or negative energy. And the takeaway from that, hopefully for you, is that rather than worrying about the ratios or worrying about how much karma did I pay back or does that make me better than, to simply relax into every good deed I do, good deed for the right reason, every extension of my heart, every time I attempt to look at something with an open mind instead of to support my agenda. Every time I push for what I believe is the good instead of pushing to get my way. All those positive intentionalities, even if they're clumsily enacted, are more powerful than negative and selfish actions. However, what happened during that month went beyond the actual lecture itself. And it's an example of the lecture. This is not something that I can define for you. It's not something I can prove. I cannot tell you what day it happened. But it was a realization process for me that the online groups had crossed over some invisible, psychic, energetic point and were doing work that was much deeper, much more honest, much more courageous, much more loving, and much more effective than they had ever done before. Now, I felt it during April, but like people talk about if they're looking at a trend, if there's a sudden little bump, you don't run out screaming to the world, we've changed course because it was a little bump. But in hindsight, I'm beginning to realize that April was a place where the turning point manifested for me. It came into my consciousness. Now, that means that there was something going on before that, but I couldn't point at it, I couldn't touch it, I couldn't feel it, and I wouldn't have made a point of saying it previously. And even when it came into consciousness for me, I allowed that I might be too close to the work, I might be exaggerating, I might be wishful thinking, so I didn't make a fuss about it. In the successive months, we have accelerated. It's not a fluke. Something is going on in these groups. Now, the relationship of what I'm saying now to the lecture, Energy and Consciousness in Distortion, is that the people who are, and I'm not advocating for the online meetings, I'm simply using them as an example that existed when this lecture was being studied. The people who are meeting online, the people who are taking the newsletter, the people who are subscribing to the monthly newsletter, the people who are subscribing to this YouTube channel. This represents for all of them an aspect of positive intentionality. Sometimes that looks like escapism. It's save me. Maybe this will work. Maybe that will work. But even that is positive intentionality. It's a desire to find a deeper belief system, a deeper realm of safety and security, even if we do that on a, I'm going to call it child consciousness. I hope this works. Or an adult, perhaps this will work. Or a spiritual level where we have looked at many things and this looks like rich material and we'll explore this for a while. All these people are engaged in their own personal spiritual journey, which in this aspect would tend to be more positive than negative. More positive than negative, because there's nothing in it for negativity. There's just nothing to hang on to here. If you want to be negative about it, it doesn't support negativity, doesn't feel juicy, make us feel good, it doesn't justify us without distorting the material. So accessing the material alone is positive intention. The people in the online meetings, sometimes some of them I have worked with for 10 to 12 years in this kind of format. It was different at first. First, I gave presentations and people listened on the phone, and then I answered some questions. I don't do presentations at the meetings anymore, although I do speak a fair portion of the time, because I feel that speaking is particularly useful in the beginning phases, in the not introductory lectures, but basic lectures. It helps to explain and exemplify them. But as you go deeper into the material, it's about finding your own relationship with the concept, your own protest, your own resistance, and working through it. And when you're working with someone's unique journey, you've got to be very adept. You've got to be jump when they jump and go where they go and track what the reasoning is and what the impulse, the agendas, the forcing currents are that are not fully conscious in the individual who is working. Trying to stay on focus here because I have a point. So some people have been working with me for 10 to 12 years in different formats, but the majority have been working for at least 1 year, if not 3 or 4 years. They've been working. This is not a passive activity. Reading the lectures is hard work. Before each meeting, I read a paragraph or two from the lecture. And even if I practice ahead of time, I inevitably stumble on the language. It is archaic, formal, structured language. It is extremely difficult to read. And I think of myself as an accomplished reader. If it's hard to simply read a paragraph, imagine what it's like to read 14 pages of material. So this is not a passive activity. Somebody's got to be very active to read the lectures. I attempt in my newsletters to take the paragraphs apart. Literally, part of what my newsletters are about is taking a dense paragraph and turning it into 7 different smaller sections. So we can read that sentence and absorb it a little bit before we go on to the next sentence, rather than thinking this is all one paragraph and I have to eat it all at once. And it can make you go numb. So I attempt to break up this material and soften it and encourage people to take one bite at a time. It's still hard work. It addresses our negativity. It addresses our resistance. It puts us into defense. So I cannot say enough for people in any spiritual discipline who hang in there. The fact that people don't do it perfectly is not surprising, since perfection is actually a barrier. It's a barrier to say, I need to do this perfectly, because you're human and that's never going to happen. As I said, I can't even read a paragraph in a lecture to an audience and not muck it up. So these people have been working. They've been not only reading the lectures, they've been reading the weekly sections of the study guide. They've been engaging in online listening and sharing of their own material. And the group has now evolved into a process group, so that it's like an individual mini session that I offer if people want to work with me. It's got to have an effect over time. And my observation is that in April, this is what came to the surface, that there's a group dynamic in all 3 of the weekly groups that I facilitate and host. Not everyone, because there's always front runners and middle of the pack and people coming in last. But if you use running a marathon as an example, to finish a marathon at all should be a badge of honor. To be allowed to compete in the Olympics alone, just to be allowed, is a victory. And I wish to allow that starting a marathon, even if you fall down in the 1st mile or the 2nd mile or the 10th mile, for that individual can mark a victory that will enable them to go on the next time. It's just not the end of the world, even though it feels like it. This is when the pathwork groups began to stop walking and start running. So I'm very honored to be able to witness their process. The second aspect of this is that I have ideas all the time, full of ideas. And I got the idea, for instance, to start filming the presentations that I was making so other people could see them, and I put them on YouTube in snippets. When YouTube only allowed 10-minute segments, I had to cut them up. So that's why there are 10-minute segments on YouTube. That's all they would permit me to upload. And then I would hold the DVDs hoping people would want them. They didn't, by the way. And then one day YouTube lifted that restriction, and I was able to upload the entire presentation, probably clumsily, because I uploaded menus and intros that may discourage some people, their amateur efforts. So I know the power of being able to listen to something many times. So a year and a half ago, I asked the groups and I have asked many times and been denied permission, but a year and a half ago, I asked the groups if I could be allowed permission to record in audio only their meeting and then send them the recordings. Only the people who participate are allowed to have these recordings, because they are for the sole purpose of allowing people to play them again, so that if they go into defense or have resistance to something that happens during the meeting, they have an opportunity to play it again and again and hear it when they're in a different place, softer place, gentler place, not so public, not feeling as much pressure as they might in a live group. I have a tendency, because of how I used to be normal, to say that's why they're growing, because after a year of recording and listening to the recordings, that's working. But that's an example of trying to justify and rationalize something that may be due to something else. I'm going to give you a real world example of that, because I actually get confused when we talk only about abstract concepts. Oddly enough, I always need a concrete way to understand it, to feel it in my body, to visualize it in my brain. So an example of what I'm talking about is scientists, and I don't know what other word to use, scientists, researchers, etc., have come to the conclusion that the declining crime rate in the United States has been going on now for 40, 50 years, which has mystified statisticians. They could not find a correlating factor to this dropping crime rate versus population. So the crime rate may stay the same, but the population's going up, so the crime rate should follow the population, but it hasn't. They couldn't figure out why. Drives them crazy. Finally, somebody said, well, what happened in the 80s? And somebody finally said they took the lead out of gasoline. And there is now a group of people who are working on the theory that taking the lead out of gasoline, cleaning up the air in our cities, had an effect of not continuing to poison its inhabitants. Why am I bringing that up? Because you can jump to all sorts of conclusions and you can rationalize and justify when the real reason may not be evident for a very, very long time. So I have a theory of this growth. I thought it was because they were allowed to listen to their own process and the process of others in the privacy of their own homes. The truth is, I have no idea what it is. Could be critical mass of how long each one of them has been participating. It could be that when one person really makes a breakthrough, a realization, others follow. That there's an inherent leadership in a group just because somebody does something and we say, whoa, what did they do? And gee, now they sound happier, and they're pulled into the process by witnessing the other person having come through it. My reason for bringing this up is I didn't want to talk about evil. I didn't want to talk about evil because that generates a lot of fear and concern in people about their own evil, and am I evil, and but this, but that, but the other. And instead I wanted to talk about the power of positive thinking, the positive intentionality of even looking at a topic. And I'm noticing the coincidence that in a month where I addressed evil, which I do not normally do, group after group, person after person had a breakthrough. The guide says there are no coincidences. Sometimes you can just touch into a negative topic gently enough where people are willing to look. And as I teach many, many times, in Pathwork Lecture 127, the 4 stages of spiritual evolution, we come out of our unconsciousness into awareness, which is a very frightening and confusing state. And if we're too overwhelmed by that, we'll try to run away from it, so we won't proceed into understanding. It is only after we proceed into understanding that we can find the knowing in ourselves, the ability to sense what is right for us in a given moment. So I feel like this presentation is at a person, at a boy, at a girl, to all the participants in the online teleconferences. I learn something every time I participate. I choose the next topic and subsequent topics based on where this group is headed. And parenthetically, that's what the guide did. He would say, I'll talk about it, but he wouldn't decide. What he said was he didn't decide that he and his team, by the way, guide didn't work individually, that he and the team did not always determine the topic that evening until the people who were going to listen to it were gathered in the room. Now, for those of you who have studied the lectures, you notice that we can still get something out of it. And yet there was some fine-tuning done for the people in the room. And there's a great power in that. And I think that there is some of that in the growth of personal process in these groups. Now, I am not always in contact with people on my contact list. Periodically, I am. The other subscribers. This may be happening in a much larger sense, and I'm just looking at the tip of the iceberg. And as icebergs will tell us, the tip of the iceberg represents a great mass, a great body of energy. So that is of more interest to me than some individual process on evil. It happened during this month's work, and so I thought that would be the most useful thing to share with you. Thanks for listening, and take care.